So here we are again, and this time we're going to look at the readings from the third Sunday of Lent, which involves the first reading from Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 to 17. Second reading, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 22 to 25. And then finally, the Gospel, John's Gospel, chapter 2, verses 13 to 25. So you may want to look at those, read those on your own when we're finished. But I'll give you a little commentary on these readings and we'll go from there. So the first reading is out of the book of Exodus chapter 20, and that's the famous Ten Commandments, and everybody's familiar with those. You can also find these in Deuteronomy chapter 5, sometimes called the Decalogue from the Greek. But basically, the Decalogue lays down the basic rules that all Jews will follow from here on out. There's a total of 613 commandments in the Old Testament if you went through every book and read all of them and counted all of them, but these 10 are the primary commandments of the law. And the first 3 commandments have to do with our relationship with God, and the second 7 have to do with our relationship with one another. So the commandments are really about building and maintaining good relationships with God and with one another. In the Jewish tradition, the number one most important commandment of all was that there is a God, there's only one God, and this God alone shall you worship. The second commandment has to deal with not using the Lord's name in vain, which means don't use God's name for purposes other than worshiping God. Don't use God as an excuse to kill people or an excuse to persecute people or anything like that. And then the third commandment, perhaps which is the greatest commandment when you really think about it in modern day culture, is to keep holy the Sabbath. In other words, spend one day a week living the way you were supposed to live. We weren't created to work and toil and struggle. We were created to have a good relationship with God. So one day a week, you do what the Jews do, and they say, let's go back to the Garden of Eden. We left the Garden of Eden, let's go back one day a week and live in harmony with God, neighbor, and self, and just enjoy life. Don't work, don't struggle, just enjoy life to its maximum. The second 7 commandments, as I said, have to do with our relationship with one another. I think most people have heard these. The 5th commandment is interesting because it says you shall not kill, but then in the book of Joshua, the Jews are ordered to kill every man, woman, and child without mercy in the promised land. So the Jews always looked at that one as you shall not kill your fellow Israelite, but non-Israelites were perfectly okay to kill during Old Testament times. The Catholic Church and the non-Catholic churches disagree a little bit on the 9th and 10th commandment. The Protestant churches say the 10th commandment is you shall not covet. The Catholic Church says the 9th commandment is you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and the 10th commandment is you shall not covet your neighbor's goods. But basically, the other commandments pretty much agree with one another. Covet simply means to conspire to take. So don't do anything that would take away the freedom of another person to have a healthy relationship with his husband or wife, or to do anything to plan to take someone else's property. So the 10 Commandments, again, we don't have time to go through all of them, but if you want to remember anything, just remember that they are really about the things we need to keep our relationship with God healthy and the things we need to do to keep our relationships with other people healthy as well. The second reading is of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapters 1, verses 22 to 25. And Paul's letter to the Corinthians was probably written around 56 AD to a small fledgling community in Corinth. Corinth was a very, very active city. It was a seaport city, a lot of people coming and going, a lot of temples, a lot of prostitution, all those kinds of things that you associate with sea towns. And Paul established a church there. It was very, very successful. And then when he left, he turned the church over to some other people, and then he would correspond to them every once in a while through letters. And scholars think that might be 4 letters to the Corinthians. We have 2 of them saved, and this first letter to the Corinthians is all about paradox, and I thought I'd share that with you briefly. Paul says, in terms of the cross, he says, "For Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews, foolishness to the Gentiles, but to those who are called, Jews and Greeks alike, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength." What Paul is saying here is the cross is something we'll never fully understand, but it's a paradox. From death comes life. And the foolish person is someone who tries to use logic and philosophy to make sense of that. The wise person is a person who just sees the cross as a sign of God's unconditional love for the world. And just as we saw last week when Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son as a sign of unconditional devotion and love of his God, so the Father is willing to sacrifice his Son as a sign of unconditional love for the human race. It's a very complicated thing, but in a nutshell, the cross is a stumbling block, but more than anything, it's a sign, it's a sacrament of God's commitment to the world. And then the final reading is out of John's Gospel, chapter 2, verses 13 to 35, the famous cleansing of the temple. And this story is mentioned in all four Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We see it at the end of the Gospel. John puts it right up in the front in the second chapter. And what happens is Jesus is praying in the temple, but the Jews had turned it into a very, very profitable place for business. If you were a pilgrim and you'd walked all the way from Galilee and you wanted to sacrifice an animal in the temple, there's no way you're going to carry the whole thing down, so you're going to buy your animals as close to the temple as possible. So they would have people selling, buying, and trading animals conveniently located. And in those days, there weren't fixed prices. Everything was bargained. And so as you approach the temple, you hear people bargaining back and forth, yelling and screaming, trying to make these sales. And Jesus finds that very, very disedifying. So the temple had become a place of commerce. Another thing you couldn't do is carry Roman coins to the temple, because Roman coins had images of gods and goddesses. So in order to buy your animal, you had to buy it with Hebrew money. But most people used Roman money as they journeyed down to Jerusalem, so they would have to change their Roman money for Hebrew money. And so they had these big piles of coins, and if you had a Roman coin and it was worth one Hebrew coin, of course you probably got ripped off, and so you'd give them a Roman coin, and you'd maybe get two half of a Hebrew coin. But anyway, it was a place of commerce, animals making noise, people buying and selling and trading. And the temple was really supposed to be a place of prayer. It was the very, very central location of the Jews' relationship with God, and it had turned into a marketplace. And one of the people who was very, very interested in the temple was Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest. He was the most powerful man in all of Jerusalem because he controlled the temple. He got a cut of any money bought into the temple area, and he was placed in power by Pontius Pilate himself. So when Jesus cleanses the temple, he is asking for trouble, because he is going to make an enemy of Caiaphas, who's very, very important among the Jews, and his very, very good friend is Pontius Pilate, and so he's also going to be an enemy of Pontius Pilate. So when Jesus is eventually arrested, one of the things he's arrested for is disrupting the civic life of Jerusalem, which really, really centered on the temple. Caiaphas had a big palace close to the temple. He did not want Jesus interfering with his nice system, and Pontius Pilate was certainly grateful for Caiaphas' assistance in getting rid of any troublemakers, especially people who tended to stir up the crowd. So again, I encourage you to look over these readings. I hope my comments today have been helpful. And again, this is from the third Sunday of Lent in year B. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.